What is JavaScript? In this video, we're going to have a complete look at all the core concepts and things you need to know about JavaScript to get started. This explains what JavaScript is, its role in the ecosystem of front-end development with HTML and CSS, and find out why it is so important and what we can actually do with it. Then we're going to have a look at some core concepts and things that you need to know to actually write JavaScript. So let's go take a look. Now, JavaScript does many things, but one of the cool things it does is it pretty much runs the web. It is the language interface for the web to add interactivity to your website. So any website you ever go to that has any kind of interaction is probably using JavaScript. If it's using any other language, it's probably being compiled down to JavaScript. It runs the web, and it also runs a lot of other disciplines as well. As you can see in this image, you can use it for front end, you can use it for back end, you can use it for mobile apps, desktop apps, machine learning. You can absolutely be a full stack developer by just knowing JavaScript alone. This is one of those core languages that's really easy to get into, but it can take you really far in your career, and you can do so many different things with it. Some of the cool stuff it can do for the web is it can help you create dynamic content, control multimedia, and animate images, amongst much more. But specifically in web development, what is JavaScript's role? Well, let's have a look at it in the hierarchy. At the very bottom, or at the very foundation, we have HTML. This builds our structural skeleton for the website. Now, in some of the tutorials you've probably already done, you've seen that we always start with HTML because that is a good starting point and a skeletal point for building your site. Then building on top of that, we have the CSS, which adds the presentational, the styling, and all the other views that make your website look pretty. But without JavaScript, we don't really have the behavioral side of your website completed. This adds all the things like your forms, your interactions, and all the things that connect it to the data layer, all of which we'll explain later on. So for a brief understanding, HTML is your foundation, CSS is your presentational and your styling, and JavaScript adds behavior and logic to your website. And as we mentioned before, with HTML and CSS, if we start from the beginning, it structures the content of the web page. CSS styles the content defined by your HTML, and on top of all that, at the final step, JavaScript adds interactivity and dynamic behavior to your web page, and it also manipulates the HTML elements and CSS styles in response to user action. So JavaScript can actually control your HTML and CSS and manipulate it as well. JavaScript has many functions and many utilities and is very powerful. It is a very deep language and it can be very useful for web development. But now we're going to have a look at some of the core concepts to do with JavaScript. These are the things that make up the absolute structure of JavaScript and the most basic things that you need to know to be effective with JavaScript. So let's go take a look at what we'll be covering. So the very first thing we'll be covering is variables. So this is how we declare our information. This is how we declare the variables that we're going to use in our code and the different data types for them. And beyond that, we'll also be looking at operators on how to compare between them and how to work between variables and data types. So these are all connected, very useful, and it will all make sense when we have a look at it. This is the first thing we're going to look at. The next thing is conditional statements. So this is how we, based on a certain condition, do a certain action with JavaScript. So this could be an if statement or a for loop. Speaking of for loops, that's what we'll be looking at next. So if this statement is correct, loop around and do this action until this is complete. And then after that, we'll be looking at functions, which is a very simple way to package up a bunch of actions into one box and use that where needed. Then after that, we're going to have a look at arrays and objects, which is how the majority of the data on the web is handled. So very important, and this will probably come up in your interviews as well. So knowing arrays and objects is going to be very important for you. DOM manipulation. Now this was a very important part of JavaScript a long time ago, and if you're using vanilla JavaScript, it's still just as important. But we're going to learn what this is and how we can actually manipulate the document object model of your web page to do whatever you want. And then finally, we're going to have a look at event handling, where we listen out for events on your page, whether it's to do with your mouse or something else or your keyboard, and we then perform an action afterwards. So these are the core things we'll be covering. Now, I know it sounds like a lot, but as we look at this image here, HTML and CSS is quite straightforward. And for a new programmer, it is pretty good. But then comes the time to learn JavaScript, which is where you are now. Don't be afraid. It is a challenge to get your head around because it's the first programming language that you're probably going to learn if you've never done programming before. But once you learn it, you can then take on any other programming language after this. So it's worth putting the time in and really buckling down and learning JavaScript and concepts like these, because a lot of these concepts you can use in other languages like loops, conditional statements, functions, arrays and objects, event handling, variables, etc. So without any delay, let's go ahead and take a look at some of these core concepts. Now, the first thing I want to look at in JavaScript is explaining how we declare variables. So these here are the three ways you can declare variables in JavaScript. And what are variables? Well, this here is called var, which stands for variable. And these are not called variable, but they are still variables. A variable is where you essentially declare a value. So it could be anything like this. So this is just a string value of just saying test. It's just some text that says test. We've given it a variable name of value. That's essentially what it is. You can do this for let, you can do this for const, and it works in the same way that it declares a value. But there are some key differences. Now, some of these differences won't make sense at this stage of your learning. But just to be clear, a var is function scoped, which doesn't make much sense at this point. And let and const block scoped. The difference is that block scoped is anything within these curly brackets, and function scope is anything within a function. So for example, function test like this. But again, we're going to go over this in more detail, but this is just to give you a brief understanding of what these values are. So variable is a very old one from the earlier days of JavaScript, and it's only very recently, since ES6, one of the later introductions of JavaScript, that these two have come about. And there's a reason why these two have come about. Variable declarations is just literally declaring a value, and there's some cons and some benefits which we'll go into later of using this, but most people now just use let and const. And in fact, they mostly use const for safety reasons. So let allows you to change the value as much as you want periodically, which is great for bits of information that change a lot, like an array or a data set. And this is great for setting values that you don't want to change. These are almost set in stone, these values. These are what they call constants. And back in the day, when you used to declare a constant, you would essentially put it in uppercase like this. And that would, so for example, is student would be like this. That's how you would declare a constant back in the day. You'd be something like var equals true. So that's how you used to be able to declare variables back in the day, back when there wasn't a const. So that is the brief difference. Let can have the value change as much as it wants. Const doesn't allow you to change it as much as you want. And these are both block scoped, which again doesn't make much sense right now, but I'll explain that later. And a variable can be redeclared, but it is function scoped. But yeah, those are the three ways you declare variables in JavaScript. If you're not sure on which one to use, just use variable for now. And then as you learn, practice and get into it, you can then start to use let and const as you understand when and where to use it. We'll just put this here. Value can be changed. Old way of declaring variables. Old/basic way of declaring variables. So there we go. That is the three main distinctions of var, let, and const. Now the next thing I want to move on to is data types. These are the different types of information that you can have in JavaScript. So a string type is essentially text. So you put some quote marks. You can either do the double quote marks or you can do the single quote marks. It's generally better to use double quote marks, just because, for example, within there, you might want to use a single quote mark. So it's always better to use double quote marks because they wrap single quote marks. So that is called a string type, which is text. And then a number type, which is 42 here, is essentially a number. And that's all that is. It's an integer. And essentially that's very simply what it is. It's when you use a number, when it doesn't have any strings around it or quote marks, it's just a number. And a Boolean type is essentially true or false. So it could be either one of these. So both of these are both Boolean types. So it can either always be true or false. And this is great for just usually checking to see if something is true or false, if something is visible or not, or if some data has arrived. And if it has, show this UI. If it hasn't, hide the UI. And that's a lot of what Booleans are used for in front-end development. And then a null type is essentially saying that I want to nullify this information. There is no information for this, or I don't want to pass any information for this. It's almost like a cancellation of data. So yeah, that's what a null is. And then undefined type is essentially used as undefined. That's how it's written. So undefined type is literally just undefined. And it can be undefined if you literally don't pass anything. If you just have a variable with no value. So normally you add a value with an equal term, with an equal sign, and then you put a value, so value. But if you put nothing in, it will be undefined under the hood, and that is a data type. So those are the core data types in JavaScript, and you'll come across these more and more as you start coding in JavaScript. So you have your string, your number, your Boolean type, your null type, and undefined. There are more and there are others, but these are the core ones that you really need to know. So now we've had a look at the data types, let's have a look at arithmetic operators. And these are basically math-based operators in JavaScript. So these are ones that are known to all of us if you've done maths. 5 plus 3, that's additional, and that equals 8. 5 minus 3, you do that with a dash, equals 3. And we basically, for timesing something or multiplying a value or a number, we use the asterisk here. So slightly different to what we're used to. Normally you'd use an X or something like that. That would make sense, wouldn't it? But it is an asterisk in JavaScript, and that would equal 15. And then we have a division here. So if you want to divide something, it's simply a forward slash, the division symbol. But we don't have that in programming. We just have the divide that we use here. And that does the same thing. That divides the number. So that is 1.67 here. And then finally, we have the remainder operator. And essentially what this does is this tells you what is remaining left over once you put these two numbers together. So it shows you what is the remainder between these two numbers. In this case, it is a 2. Now this one isn't used as much and it's not really as important, but it's always good to know what is out there. Some of the core ones are really these ones, and it's just the same as maths really. You just need to know that you use asterisks at times and a forward slash for divide. Now, the comparison operators are some of the most useful operators out there. These are the things that you're going to be using time and time again, especially when you start using more JavaScript and even TypeScript. So let's have a look. So this here is a very simple check to see if something is equal to something. So normally you have this first equal sign, which means I'm declaring a value. This is this value. And then if you use more than that, then it's doing a check. So it's checking to see if something is equal. So that's why it's 2. And in this case, 5 is equal to 5, even though this is a string because it's got quote marks around it, and it's equal to true. And then what we do is we do a type check, which is the 3 triple check. So this is a strict equal check. So this checks the type as well as the value. So that's why there's 2 more. And the types do not match because this is a number and this is a string. They are 2 different data types like we just looked at earlier. So this is false. Now we're checking to see if something is not equal when we add this exclamation point. And in programming, they generally call it a bang. But yeah, it's an exclamation point. So it's checking to see if 5 is not equal to 5. But because it knows within there that there is a 5 and this is a 5, it's actually done the calculation for us. And they are the same and they are equal. So it's declared it false. And that is one thing about JavaScript, that within a string, if it's just a number value, it will take the number value out of it. But there are some caveats to that. So then we're doing a strict check to see if something is not equal by type. So we're not just checking the values inside, we're also checking the types. And it is true that these are not the same types. So therefore it's come back true because that is a string and that is a number. So now we're checking to see if something is greater than with this forward arrow. We're trying to see if 5 is greater than 3 and 5 is greater than 3. So it returns true, which is a Boolean value. So if you console log this, that's what you would get, these values here. And then we check to see if 5 is less than 3. You always go from left to right to check the values. So you see here that this is a backwards arrow and we're checking to see if 5 is less than 3, and that is obviously false because 5 is a higher number than 3. So that is the less than operator. And then we have the greater than or equal to operator. So we're checking to see if 5 is either greater or equal to 5. And that's true. It is equal to 5. It didn't match the condition that it's greater than, but it did match the condition that it is equal to. So it checks essentially 2 checks there with this one. So this is the greater than or equal to operator. And finally, we have the less than or equal to operator. So we're checking if 5, remember we go from left to right. We're checking if 5 is less than or equal to 5. Similar to above, it's not less than because they're equal, but they are equal here. So this one is ticked true. So then that comes back as a true statement as a Boolean. So those are the comparison operators in JavaScript, which you will probably use more as you progress in JavaScript and as we start using more TypeScript. Let's move on to conditional statements. Now, these are really important for being able to show something as a conditional. So if you want to show UI or if you want to show some data based on a condition that you've set, these are some of the methods that you can do this with. So at the very top, we're declaring a value with let, which we learned about earlier, which is just a variable, and we've called it 85, and we've made it a let because we want to change the value as we go along. I cut the last bit. Now the 3 values or the 3 conditional statements we'll be looking at is if, else if, and else. And I'll show you what if is here. So if this score is greater than 90, we're going to console log grade A. Well, it's not greater than 90, it's in fact less than 90. And then we have another declaration here. So this is else if is used when you want to add another check on top of the initial if. If is usually the first one you do, and then this is the second one you do. This is the one that you use in the middle. So you could actually do 20 more of these and you could just line these up like this. So you could have lots of different checks. But for now, we're just going to use one. So if the score is greater than 80, then return grade B. Well, that is correct because this is greater than 80, so this will return grade B. But if it doesn't meet any of those conditions, so for example, if this is 70, then this should return grade C. So let's put in a number, let's put in 70, and there you go. It returns grade C. But if we change the number to 100 or 1000 even, it then returns grade A because it's doing the first check. It is greater than 90, so it's going to return grade A. And that is how if, else if, and else statements generally work. And this is just another example of that. So this asks you to put in a number. So if I clear this now and just change this, we're checking to see if the user input is greater than 0. And if it is greater than 0, it's going to say it's a positive number. If it's less than 0, it's going to say it's a negative number. So let's put in a negative number here, and then it's going to tell us that it is a negative number, which is exactly what we wanted, and that makes sense to us. In fact, we can delete this now. So again, this is an if statement, and generally when you write an if statement, it's an if, you put your condition in here. So I'll say user input is greater or equal to 0, and if that is the case, let's just comment this out for now. By the way, if you do want to do a multi-line comment, you can do asterisk and forward slash and then close it in the opposite way at the end, so you can see forward slash asterisk, asterisk forward slash, and you can multi-line comment out code in JavaScript. So if we said if user input is greater than or equal to 0, we'll console.log greater or equal to 0, and that is a basic if declaration. Okay. And then if we then we put this back, so we delete the comments on here, and then it should prompt us to put in a number, and then I will put in 0, and there we go. And then we'll do an else statement as well, just to say if it isn't. Okay, so let's put in -5, and there we go, is less than 0. Excellent. So that's essentially the core of conditional statements. We're putting in some statement here, and then we're doing some checks, and based off those checks going a particular way, we then add our logic here. And if it doesn't go that way, then we can also say, if in case it doesn't happen and our check is not passed, this is what I want to happen. So that is if, else if, and else for conditional statements in JavaScript. Okay, let's have a look at for loops. We have a for loop here, similar to our if statement. We have a condition here. We're declaring this variable here, which is a let, is equal to 0. But then I is going to change because it is a let, and let value can change. As long as the value is below 5, it is going to keep looping through it. So it's going to say this plus plus means it's going to keep going and keep adding the value to it until it reaches 5. So let's go take a look. If I change this to -1, it's going to go from -1 to 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 until it is near to 5. And that is a for loop. So if I change this to 0 now, it needs to do less because we are closer to the final value required. And that essentially is a simple for loop. And then we can add these comments here, and then we can do multi-line comments. Do multi-line comments for JavaScript. And then we'll uncomment this. Now below here is what we call a while loop. And you can see that it's gone through the values already. We'll clear that just to show you again. So we can declare the value here. So if I say -10, so it's saying this value here, we're checking that the condition is less than 5. And whilst it is less than 5, keep running this code again and again and again until we reach this condition here, which is 5. So I started at -10. It went 10, 9, 8, 7, all the way up until it matched 5. So then what we do is, so that it meets the 5 instead of just the 4, we say it's also equal to. We add the equal to or less than operator as well. So we go -10 all the way to 5 now, because we're also saying we also want the check to make sure that it is 5. So that is the core difference between a while loop and a for loop. So a for loop is whilst this condition, so the core difference between these two, the for loop and the while loop, is that the condition here and the value here is known. We're saying that the value is 0 and we want it to be less than 5. And we're saying whilst this is true, and we're saying run this until we get to our value. A while loop is essentially saying this is our condition, and until it is proven wrong, keep running this until we are continued to be proven wrong. So that's the main difference between a while and for loop. Generally, you'll probably end up using a for loop more in modern day code than a while loop. While has gone a little bit out of fashion, and for is generally what you're going to use more often than not, if you are going to use it at all. So let's have a look at functions. Now, functions are one of the most important things on this list alongside declaring variables. This is one of the things that you are probably going to use the most on this entire list. The idea is that you essentially have a box of values and a box of logic that you can reuse again and again and again. So for example, if we have a function at the most simplest level, hello world, and then within here we have a little set of a little parentheses that we can put a parameter in. We won't for now. And then we do curly brackets, open here, and we can then add any logic we want. So I'll separate this out. And the function we can say is console.log hello world. Okay, so that is the function that we want, and we want to now use this. We've created this, we've declared it, but we want to be able to use it in our code. Well, how would you do that? So the way you would actually do that is you would say, and then what we want to do is we want to add some logic to our function. And the way we do that is we say return, and this is the value that we want the function to return, and we'll just put hello world as the value. And then when we're done with our line of JavaScript, we can then add the semicolon here, and that essentially ends the line of code when you add that. You don't have to add it here, but if you have multiple lines of code, it is generally a good practice to add that. Then at the end here, what we want to do is actually use this function. So we've declared it, but we do want to use it in our code. Well, what's the simplest way to call it? Well, the simplest way to call it is essentially use the name here and type in hello world /. Now, this isn't actually doing anything. Right now, it's just right now it's just returning a value, but we want to actually use this value in some way. So one good way to do it is by using a console log. So you can see I've got the console open below, which is this little dark gray area. And if I type in console.log, which is a general way you put values into this console for testing, and I type in hello world, it then should invoke that function and run it in the console and return the value that we set here. So I can change this to whatever I want. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it should also change that value that's returned in this console log statement. And there's other ways you can do this as well. So if I just return this to hello world, and then I put the console log in the function itself, I'll put 5, you can then see it's just console logging from the function itself, and I don't need to wrap this in a function because I've added my own logic. Now, there are other ways to see if values are being returned and other bits of logic we can use similar to console log. One of them is alert. And this basically brings up a prompt window. It pops up on your screen like this, and it gives you the value here. So here it says hello world 12345, and it basically pauses everything on your screen, but you can press OK. And it's a good way of just showing something really quickly without having to open up the console, and it goes over your UI on your website. So we'll return this to console.log for now, and then there we go. That is the basics of a function. For a little bit more context, there are a lot more things you can do inside a function. So for example, you can declare a variable. So if we say const name, and we'll call it Harry. So I can say within here, after here, if I do a comma, if I add a space and then do a plus sign, I can add two values together. So I'll put name in here as well, and then clear that. And then you can say hello world 12345 Harry. So I've put two values together inside my function, and I've declared a value in my function. Now I've made it a const, so it can't change the value, so I can't redeclare it. But if I made this a let and then changed the name to Larry, you then should see that the name can be changed. But you can't do this with a const. It just won't allow it. So these are some of the shenanigans you can get up to within a function. You can declare variables, and you can use it within the function and use it in the return statement to do whatever you need it to do. And that is the basics of using a function in JavaScript. Now, we touched on parameters earlier, which is essentially these values within these parentheses here. And I'm going to show you how that works, because you can essentially, with a function, pass in values here, which are called parameters, and then you can use them for whatever you want. And it's very, very powerful. And the more you get to know with JavaScript, the more you'll realize how useful parameters are. At this very early stage, it might not be clear, but very later on, it will be very, very useful. So let's take, for example, this function here, which is called add. And essentially, we're just adding the first parameter and the second parameter together, which gives us 8. But what happens if we want to do something else? So I'll do console log result here, which is basically getting these two values from this function. Currently it's logging 8, but what if we do a minus b? It then returns 2, because we're saying 5 is a and 3 is b. Well, that's okay. What if we want to add another parameter? So we'll say c, and we'll say c equals 10. And then we'll say we want to times by 10. Whatever the value is, and that is minus 25. Well, what if we do a plus b times 10, and then the value changes accordingly? So you can start to see how powerful parameters are. It can give you variables within your function to use, and these only live in the function, by the way. You can't use these values outside of your function. These are function scoped. So in the last example, how I showed you how we could declare values, you don't actually need to if you use parameters very well, because you can then call the function or invoke it and then just add other variables from outside of the function scope into it via these parameters. And it's a really cool concept, and it's a really good and useful system of using values within your function. So that is function with parameters and the return value, which is the value returned from your function. Now, earlier I spoke about functions being really, really important, as well as the variable declarations in JavaScript, but arrays are the third most important. These are things that you are going to use every single day, and I can't emphasize how important arrays and objects are, but more so arrays. So we'll look into why arrays are so important. Generally, when you're using data on the web, it comes in some kind of array format, and this is a basic array format. So we've got a variable declaration here, so let fruits, and we're saying that is equal to these 3 strings within here, or 3 bits of text. They're within these squarish brackets here. That's what we call an array bracket or a square bracket. And we've got an apple text or string declaration, and then it's divided by a comma, and then banana as a string and cherry as a string as well. And together, these 3 values make up the value of this string array. So this is a string array here because there's only strings in here. And if we wanted to get a particular value, and if we wanted to console log this, all we do is we console log the fruits array here, and we get back apple, banana, and cherry. What if we wanted a particular value from the array? So for example, if we wanted cherry, well, the way an array works is there are indexes. So if you can imagine that these all have a hidden number. So every single one of these has a hidden number that you can't see underneath it. And I can prove that to you. So if I was to go and type in fruits 1, which number do you think that's going to return? If you thought it was apple, because it's the first in the list, that makes absolute sense. And it surely can't be banana or cherry because they're second and third in the list. So let's have a look. Well, interestingly enough, it returned banana. So why did it return banana as number 1 when it's clearly second? Well, like I mentioned earlier, all these values have a hidden number value beneath them. And normally, if the list of values started at 1, that would be great. This would then not make any sense, and it should have been really apple that was coming out first. But the actual first number of these values in the array actually starts at 0. And this is unique to arrays. So if we set this to 0 now, we should see that it returns the first one. Because in an array, the value always starts at 0. So it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. It always starts at 0. That is the first number in an array index. And an index essentially is the hidden number value behind the order in which this appears. So then if I want to get cherry, I don't put in 3, I actually put in 2, and then I get cherry. It's always the number you want minus 1. So 3 minus 1 should get you cherry. So if I wanted the second one, which is banana, then I would do 2 minus 1, and then it would return banana. And if I wanted 1, which is the first one, I would just put number 1 minus 1. But in reality, it's just easier to remember that it starts at 0. So that is the array index and a basic array declaration. And it's a collection of values that just come in a list. So that's the easiest way to remember what an array is. It's essentially a list of values. Now, it's all well and good having this fruits array, which has 3 in here. But what if we want to add another value into here, but without actually having to type it in? If we want to add it later on in the process, well, there is a method called push, which essentially pushes an item into an array right at the very end. So for example, if we fruits.push orange, and then we console log fruits at this point, I'll delete this, it then should add orange at the very end of the list, like here. And then we can add some more. So we can add kiwi, and then it should add kiwi at the end. And if we decide we want to add, pear as well, we then increase the array size to 6, and we can even declare it. So we use the 6 minus 1 method, it'll return pear and 5 as well. And on a very basic level, that is how arrays work. There's obviously ways to remove items from the array and filter items and do all kinds of other things, but we'll leave that for another video. This is a really basic rundown of arrays in JavaScript, and this gives you a really good understanding of what they are and what we can kind of use them for. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is objects. So objects are really, really important as well. In actuality, functions, which we looked at earlier, when you see this curly bracket here, that actually is an object. So anything that generally has these curly brackets is usually an object of some kind. We have this object here called person, and we'll look at this as an example. And this is very similar to an array in that this is a list of values, but this is very, very slightly different. So an object is a list of values, but you can access the information differently. It has a different set of ways that you can manipulate this data type, which is an object, and the values within it are arranged slightly differently. So if you remember in an array, so if we say let array equals orange, and then we'll say pear, it's very linear. It's like one declaration, comma, and then the next declaration, but you don't really know what these are. Now, an object is very different. So an object is declared with curly brackets, and if we open it, we have a key, and then we do semicolon, and then we put a value. And this is what we call, I'll make this bigger, a key value pair. This is very, very important in objects. This is very important to understand as a concept for JavaScript. And that is, you have a key, which is the name of the value. And this is how you reference this value and how you can get this value out of here. And it's very different to how arrays work. Now, this is something you're probably going to get asked about in interviews, and it's going to come up in some kind of test if you are applying for a front-end developer job. A good concept to know. So for example, if I was to console log object and I clear that, you can see that it just returns the entire object with the key and the value. But what if we have more than one? So we do a comma, and then we'll go and do this, and we'll put age, and we'll put name here as a value. So I'll put Harry, and I'll put 100, I guess. I'll clear that. And then you can see that it's changed to now return name Harry and age 100. But what if I want to just return name? Well, if I just want to return the name, I can do object.name, a much simpler way of calling a value. And then I can just get the name. And then if I just want the age, I can just type in .age. And you can see already there's a lot more that you can do with this than just a simple array. And it makes a lot more sense. It's a lot more semantic to understand and a lot more human friendly. Whereas just putting numbers for an array isn't quite as easy to kind of get your head around. So that is essentially how to get values from an object on a very, very basic level. So we'll get rid of all this. We'll go back to our example. So we have this person object, and this is probably more akin to what you're going to be doing in your work. You're going to have these objects. So for example, name, John, age 30 is student, and then you have to do something with that value. So you can then take this object value and then you can use it in your UI in some way. So for example, if we have a paragraph element, we can then add the information as person.name. And that essentially grabs the value from the object and then grabs the name value and puts it within the paragraph element to use here. And that's how essentially you would use an object in your front end. So we've already shown you how to call values from an object. So for example here, if we get the name from this list, it's currently John. If we change it to Larry, it'll then update to Larry there as well. So that's all well and good. So that is objects in a nutshell. Now you may be thinking, well, this seems way better than using an array. Array seems worse. How is an array more useful than an object? Well, I'll tell you why an array is more useful than an object in one moment. It is because you're going to be using arrays more. So for example, if I show you this, so I'll put const data, and I'll say data is equal to an array, but the array is going to have the value of person. Now person is this object here. And then if I console log that, you'll see exactly what I mean. So if I console log data, I clear this, what we have here is an array with an object inside it. So let's get this value here and I'll show you what I mean. And we'll do a block comment. Most data that you're going to use on the front end is essentially going to be an array which has objects inside of it. So for example, if you want to get user data, you might have multiple users that are within this array, and they all have different data sets, but they're all contained within an array. So you need to get used to seeing objects within arrays. And that's why arrays actually are very, very important, because that is the wrapper for all your data generally. It's very rare that you just get back an object for single use and for single manipulation in your front end, but generally it will come in an array of some kind. That is some real world use cases of actually using objects and arrays, and why you should know both of these and why they're so important. So now let's have a look at the next core concept, and that is DOM manipulation. So JavaScript can actually manipulate the HTML and CSS on your web page. And not only that, it can actually get values and selectors from your HTML. So for example, in your HTML, we have these two elements here. We have a H1 and we have a button, and we can actually grab those values. So for example, the H1, we can declare a variable. So we'll call it heading. And then we're going to say, let's go and grab that from the document model using the document method. And then we're going to select it by using the .query selector H1. And what that essentially does is that goes into your HTML and it grabs the value from this H1 and then it puts it here in heading. So if I go here and do console.log heading, it should then return in my console the object that I was looking at. And if I do dot value, it should return just the value within it. And if I do value, now, for example, it's returning hello world, but if I wanted to change the text within that, I could do something like this. So I know we've got the console open. We'll just close the console down for now, and then we can see our HTML here. Now, what if I try to change the text within my H1 to something else? So I'll go heading.inner HTML, and I'll say that equals to Harry was here. And you can see now with JavaScript, we're able to manipulate the text on the page by setting the inner HTML by using query selector. So very, very powerful. And we can do the same with the button. So if we do button inner HTML and we equal it to hello world, what's up? Oops, maybe not that. What's up? You can see we've changed the text on the button as well. Now that is how we change the HTML. But what if we want to actually change the styling? So for example, if we do button.style.background, and then we change the background to red, and then we say, well, we don't just want the background to be red, we want the color to be white of the text. We can do that as well. So we've changed the background to red, and we've also changed the color to white, but it's not looking too great. I think I'll prefer more padding. So I'll do padding, and I'll put 20 pixels on the top of the bottom and 100 pixels from left to right. And then you can see the button is huge. But I don't like the pointed corners on the sides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it well rounded. So I'm going to do 20 pixels like this. And obviously you can do funky stuff like this as well, and you can manipulate it to look a little weird. And that is DOM manipulation. That is how we change the HTML and CSS on the very most basic level with JavaScript. Now, the very last thing we're going to be looking at is event handling. So how do we actually handle events in JavaScript? Well, we've just shown you how we can access elements on the HTML, which is here. And now we're actually going to wait to listen for events and do something about it. So here we've got a button variable declaration. So similar to the last example, we're going to the document and we're selecting the button using query selector. And this essentially goes for the button tag, which is this here. It's not looking for a class, it's not looking for an ID, it's just looking for the tag here. So we're just looking for button. So now that it has that as a value, we're then saying we're going to listen out by using the add event listener method, and we're looking for a click. And then when we click on that button, it's going to say button was clicked by using an alert, which we've seen in use before. So if I go to this button here and I type in click me, we then should have an alert appear on our screen because we listened out for the click event and we executed an action. Now you could do whatever you want here. So for example, if you click the button, we can change the style to red, for example, and we'll just comment that out for now. So then if I go to button now, and if I click it, it should change it to red. So those are some of the things you can do with add event listeners for buttons on a very basic level. But what happens if we want to grab some information from, say, let's say an input, like a text value input here. So if I want to change the text on that. So for example, we've got the let input here, and we're checking on the document using the query selector to grab the tag, which is the tag input here. I'm actually just going to increase the padding on this so it's easier to see. So I'm going to go put input style just to see if it works. And we'll say it's equal to 20 pixels. And there we go. That is a bit larger, and we'll add 100 pixels padding on the side as well. Okay. So now if we type something into here, and we'll also actually increase the font size. Okay. So if we type, so now we've added some basic styles to here with JavaScript. Let's do a bit more. Let's actually use an event listener here. So we're saying with the input, we're going to add an event listener. So we're going to add something that it needs to listen in for. And we're saying when the user types something into the input, I then want to do something. And what is that something? Well, I want to then input this value. Well, right now it's putting it to the console. So if I open up the console now, and I'll clear this, and I'll open up the console. And then if I type in, hello, welcome to Frontend now, you can see that this is listening in for the input value from the input and typing it in below in the console. So it's getting the value and it's completely up to date because I've finished typing and it's got every single character in there. And this is great for when you're creating forms, or if you're getting the user to sign up for something, you can take the value and then use it elsewhere. Well, where else could we use it? Well, if we create a paragraph element under here and we'll give it an ID of text, and then we'll say, and we won't actually put anything in there for now. And then we'll just put input text goes here, and then we'll declare the value. So over here, we'll go let text value equals document.query selector, and then we'll do P. So actually we don't need this ID, so we can delete that. Okay, so now that we have the text value here, let's just make sure we're getting that. So we'll do console.log text value, and yep, we can see that we're now getting that value here, which is brilliant. So we are going to use that now in this event listener. So I'm going to clear the log, and all we're simply going to do is, whilst this is console logging, we are going to change this to text value equals input.value. So we're essentially taking the value from the input and putting it into text value here. So then if I start typing something here, and then we say return, and then type something here. And then what we also need to do is make sure we're targeting the inner HTML. So we're saying the inner HTML of text value needs to be equal to the input.value, which is of the input. So if I type something here, you can see now that the inner HTML of this paragraph element is changed to whatever I am typing into this input. And there you go. That is the core basics of using event listeners in JavaScript. And there you go. Those are all the things that we've covered is the core aspects of JavaScript. We've gone over variables, data types, and operators. We've had a look at conditional statements, loops, functions, arrays, and objects, which are quite important, DOM manipulation, and finally, event handling. Hopefully, after this video, you now have a very basic understanding of some of the core concepts of JavaScript, and you can go away and start actually practicing and playing around with it. So feel free to watch this video again. So remember, JavaScript can be used for many things. It has its place in the hierarchy of the web, and it is one of the 3 crucial pillars to being a front-end developer. So make sure you practice all these core concepts and try to get an idea of what each and every single one is, because we will be using them in our projects going forward. And that has been our whirlwind tour of JavaScript. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next one. Let, const, and var. These are the 3 main variables for JavaScript. In this video, we're going to have a look a little deeper into each and every single one of these and find out how useful it is to use these and at what point we should. So let's go take a look. So on a very simple level, these are the 3 variable declarations that you can use in JavaScript. We have your var, which stands for variable. We have your let and your const, which stands for constant. How each and every one of these is different to one another. Let's start with var. Now, var generally is globally scoped. And what we mean by scope is within a document, at what point can it be declared? So traditionally, it is function scoped, but it can also be globally scoped if it is declared outside of a function, just like this. So this is declared outside of a function, and therefore it has global scope, and we have access to it globally in the document. Now, variables declared with var can be redeclared and updated. So for example, if we clear this and I console log var, it should return John. That's because we've set it here. However, if I redecline it here as Joe, it then should redeclare it. And I'm using the exact same declaration. So now there's 2 declarations of the same name. But because I did this after, later down the road, I'm actually able to redeclare it and change it to whatever I want. We can keep repeating this. And that is one of the unique things about a variable out of the 3 declarations. Variable is quite indicative of JavaScript in that it's very forgiving towards having errors, and it still tries to run the code as best as it can so that you can carry on with your functionality And this is just another, I guess, trait of JavaScript for that you can redeclare your variables. But we don't really use variable as much anymore now that we have the other two. And I'm going to explain why after we move into those two. But for now, this is quite an old way of declaring variables in JavaScript. And doing stuff like this isn't really considered safe or good practice. So for now, we'll just delete these other two and we can comment this out again. Now, var itself is not block scoped. So it doesn't respect the boundaries of blocks like if statements, like this one. So if we were to console log this out, and I'll clear this, you can see that it now is able to be redeclared and calls Jane. And again, that's because it isn't block scoped. It isn't only able to just stay within this block here. And when we say block, we mean these curly brackets here. Essentially anything within that is considered its own block. So if I was to delete this and console log this, you can see it then console logs Jane from here. So it can be redeclared and it isn't block scoped. So that is the basics of the variable declaration in JavaScript. Now moving on to let is actually block scoped. So that means it respects the boundaries of things like an if statement. So block being within these curly brackets, it will stay within here. So for example, if I was to console log age, it should show me 30. But if I was to console log within the if statement, it should show me 25 because I'm console logging within the block statement and let is block scoped. So it will always respect the inner scope of this first. Now let can be redeclared as we see here, but it can't be redeclared within the same scope. So for example, if under here I try to redeclare this as 23, it gives me an error because within the same scope you can't actually redeclare it. It says age has already been declared, and that is correct, but it's okay to do it within the block scope here. And essentially that is a let. You can redeclare it, you can change this value. So for example, if we have a console log under here, and I'll clear this, it should return 30. But if I then underneath go age equals 10, it then should be able to change that value without having to redeclare it, which is how it differs from a variable and is also quite different from const, as we're about to see. So a const declaration or variable is a constant value. So this is almost like setting it in stone. We don't want this value to change and we want it to be consistent. We also don't want it to be redeclared and we don't want to be able to change the value. So for example, if I console log city, it should show me New York as expected. That's the value. However, if I try to do what I did with let and I go city equals London, for example, clear that, it won't allow me to do it because I'm trying to reassign it to a constant variable and that won't work. The only way this is going to work is if I create a new const and I'll put city2 and then console log that. So city returns New York and city2 will return London. And this makes sure that you respect the value that is within there and it doesn't allow you to manipulate that value and change it. And you can have a lot more confidence of the information you're about to receive because you are using a constant. It is a constant value that remains and is set in stone. Okay, so we know now that we can't redeclare this and we know that we can't also change the value later on. Now, similar to let, it is also block scoped. So it does respect that. So if I console log the city here, it should return San Francisco, which is what we expected because this is respected within the block, which is the curly brackets, and doesn't try to go outside of here into the global scope and grab this value and this version of the declaration here. And like we've already mentioned, variables declared with const cannot be reassigned after their initial assignment. So I couldn't do this after, like we've already shown. But just to double check, even within a block scope of an if statement, you can't do that either. Now, another final bit on const, because it's fairly straightforward. It's a variable that is just set as a constant. It's almost set in stone. Now, a variable kind of gives you a best of both worlds of let and var. But the whole point of separating them is that it helps you write clearer and less error-prone code by providing block level scoping and preventing accidental reassignment of variables. And that is the reason why we have a let and const variables and we don't just use var anymore. Var is a thing of the past and is an old way of declaring JavaScript variables. Now, as you're learning to code, you can still use var to get going, to get started, but eventually you will want to start using const and let where required. But again, that comes with practice and with time, and depending on the type of information you have in front of you and that you need to manipulate, then you use the one that's best for that situation. But for now, for learning, it's fine to use var, but understand that when you actually take on an enterprise level job or work, that they will want you to be using let and const in your work, as they'll be expecting you to use let and const. So there you go. Those are the key differences between let, const, and var when it comes to making JavaScript variables. JavaScript arrays. We're going to have a deep dive into what they actually are. We've had a brief look already, but I want to have a look at some more methods that are more useful to actually interacting with arrays, have a look at some different ways that we can actually utilize it, and explain on a deeper level how arrays work and how we can use them. So on a brief level, arrays are used to store multiple values in a single variable. They come with numerous methods to perform traversal and mutation operations. So with that in mind, let's go take a look. So as we mentioned earlier, arrays are used to store multiple values in a single variable, almost like a list. It's very linear. One thing, then a comma, then another thing, and a comma, and then one other value. So it's one value, then another value, then another value. Now each of these values have their own hidden index value, which means the order in which they appear in the array. Now with a JavaScript array, they actually appear at a 0 index order, and what that means is this value starts at a 0 and then it goes 1 and then it goes 2. So that is the hidden index value. So if we delete these, we can console log and show you how that works. So for example, if we try to console log 0 to access the first index, we can see that it rightly returns apple. And if we do +1, it should return banana. And that is correct, because then that will be index 1. So 0 plus 1 is 1. Okay. And then again, if you want to access banana, you can put 1 in, and that is fine. You can also add conditionals in here. So you saw that I had +1. You could add some conditionals in here to change the index order. So when you get further into JavaScript, you can do stuff like this. You don't just have to put a single value in. You can put in some logic here to dictate what the index is. So if I did 3 minus 1, and I clear this, it will return cherry, because 3 minus 1 is 2, and the hidden index number is starting at 0, then it's 1, and then it's 2. So if that equals 2, then that will be cherry, and that's fine. So that's how we access the elements. Very simple. Now, if we want to push an item to the array, we can use the push method on the array. So we've got fruits declared up here, let fruits, and we're pushing orange onto the array. So if I console log this, and we're console logging fruits by pushing orange, you can then see that we have now orange as the 4th item of the array. And because it's the 4th item and it's a 0 index array, it's going to be an index number of 3. So if I was to do console log 3, it should then show me orange. Yep, and that's working as intended. Now, something that we haven't gone over before are some other methods of manipulating the array. So things like removing items from the array. So sometimes what may happen is that we might want to remove items at the end of the array or at some point just to trim something. If we've, for example, if we have a to-do function and we want to delete something, we may want to delete a particular item in the array. So if we go here and we're saying, for now, remove the last element, we'll just use pop indiscriminately. So then if we console log that, it should remove orange from that list. Now the reason why is because we're pushing orange just before it. So orange is in the array, but if I was to comment this out and then it runs the entire JavaScript file again, orange should be back. So just a note on how JavaScript works. It runs from top to bottom. So it runs from the top of your file all the way down to the bottom. So if we've declared our values here, the array, it's then going to push orange to it. And then here we're removing it, but I've commented that out. So it's just going to console log what we've already done there. But if I put this down and get rid of the comment, it's then going to run through the JavaScript file again, and it is going to remove orange. thought I'd just let you guys know about that. Now, very interestingly, if we want to go over the entire array, we use a method called map. Now, I can't stress enough how important this map method is. This is something as a front-end developer you're probably going to use every other day. Arrays are super important, and the map method is equally as important as the array, because that is how you are going to manipulate your data and access your data through mapping. So I'm going to clear this right now, and I'm just going to explain what we're doing here. So we're declaring a variable called uppercase fruits as a let variable. And we're saying fruits, which is the array up here, we are going to map over it. And you do that simply by doing dot map. And then within that, we're creating a function. So you see these curly brackets here. Everything here is a function. So I could even put this onto its own line. You can see exactly what's going on. And then I can just push this forward a bit. So this is living within the map method, which is just, because it's within the parentheses, it's actually a parameter in a sense. It's actually a parameter for the map method. So within here, we have a function, and it's called, and this is just an anonymous function. And within here, we're passing a fruit parameter. And the way we're getting that is because fruits is mapping over the entire array, we're actually saying that fruit is the individual item name or the individual variable for all of these now, and that is function scoped or block scoped within here. So we can't use fruit outside of here. So that's always a tricky thing to work with, but once you get used to it, it's absolutely fine. So now that we've got access to fruit, which is essentially each individual array item, you can then do stuff with it. So we're saying we're going to make it all uppercase. So if I console log that, it now should one after another show me all of the array items and make them uppercase. Excellent. And there you go. You can see now that it's made all of these items uppercase and it has pushed them out. One more other thing we could do is, instead of having just the array become uppercase, we could do something else. So I could then declare this like this. I'm just going to comment that out. Get rid of that. So now all we're doing is we're declaring this variable here, which is uppercase fruits. And I'm going to take this action out, which is making uppercase, and I am going to console log that out. And all I'm going to console log is fruit. But up here, I'm going to make sure that it makes it uppercase first, and then it logs it all out up here. And then all I do is I call on the map, and there you go. Oh yeah, so that is true. So I'm getting an error here that says uppercase fruits is not a function, and that is correct. So I'll clear that. And one by one, it is calling on every single item in the array because it's mapping over the array, and I'm console logging the fruit. Now I can take it one step further. So if I get rid of this and put it here so that it definitely works, and then I clear that, it then makes it all uppercase. And that is the power of being able to use the map. You then have so much more control over your array, and it is the bread and butter of a front-end developer, of being able to use data and manipulating data to put into the UI. And there you go. Those are the core fundamentals of using an array in JavaScript. JavaScript objects. Now, objects are a collection of key value pairs. They are used to store and manipulate data that is related in some way. And just like arrays, they are equally important in JavaScript. So let's go take a look at what objects are. So a JavaScript object is fairly easy to declare. We can, for example, make an object like this. So if we use a let variable, and we'll call it person, and we'll say it's equal to these curly brackets. And the curly brackets generally means that whatever we're using is an object. So as we've seen in the past, if you create a function, because it has the curly brackets, in actuality behind the scenes, this is an object. There's a lot of things in JavaScript that are actually sneaky objects. But what is an object? Well, like we mentioned earlier at the start of the video, they have key value pairs. So a key value pair is, let's say, something like this. This is considered the key, this value here. And then the value here is, let's say, for example, John. So we can say that this is the key and this is the value. And if I change this to name, that makes more sense. So key value pair. And that's how objects are populated. And there's many ways that you can populate an object. It doesn't just have to be text or a string. It can be a number. It can be a Boolean. So like this, and you can even add functions within it. So if I do function and so if I do an anonymous function like this, I do console.log, hello, my name is, then we add a space and then we do plus, and we go this dot name. And this essentially what this does is it grabs a variable from this block scope. So the block scope, again, if you remember, is within a curly brackets. So this is going to this scope here, and it's grabbing the name, which is John. So if I then put person here and I clear this, if I then console.log person, if I then call person.greet, if I then call person.greet, it should then console log out what we declared above. So then I can change this value to Harry, for example, and that's essentially how you access individual things in here. So for example, we're accessing something that's a function that does a console log, but what if we want to console log any of these values? Well, we just do a console log here and we'll say age, for example. Oops, we forgot to actually call the object. So obviously we call the object, which is called person, and then we type in age, and there we go. That has then brought us the age. So essentially using key value pairs, we declare the object here, and then we use the key value, which is one of these purple ones here on the left-hand side, to essentially call upon whatever value we've set here. And that is the core of how object data access works. So if I say is student, so we want to access the value there, it should come back with false. But what if we actually want to modify these objects? Well, because it's a let, we can actually do that. So if, for example, I go here and I want to change the age, so I'll go person.age equals 40, I can just redeclare that value here. And then all I do is I just change the console log here, and now it is changed to 40. And then if I redeclare it again, but I change it to 20, it's now changed it to 20, because the precedence is whatever is written last, or was the latest thing you've written further down the page, because again, JavaScript reads from top to bottom, it's going to read the latest thing you've read. So I can delete that now, and that should be fine. And with Booleans, there is actually another way we can redeclare that as well. Because if you try to do is student equals true, and then I did is student and I clear this, we can actually change this to true as well. So you can do this with pretty much any value. So that's how we modify objects on the simplest of levels. Now we can even do something completely different. So for example, if we decide that we want to add the city for this person object, we can then type city here and then put the value as New York, and then console log the city, and then it should console log New York for us. Now we haven't added city here, but we've retroactively added it because this is a let variable. Now interestingly enough, you may think, oh okay, well as an object, as a let, that's probably why I can do something like this. So if I was to change this to a const, then that means I shouldn't be able to manipulate the object because consts are essentially set in stone and you're not able to change them. Well, it turns out you can. Now, as an object, it has its own rules for its own key value pairs, and you can actually rewrite them. So for example, within here, if I was to add city and then say London, it's still going to redeclare it to New York, but if I was to delete this, it should say London. So that's how you can add new properties. So you can either manually add them or you can redeclare them later on to the object. And then if we decide we want to remove one of these key value pairs from the property, let's say for example city, we can do it very simply by typing in delete and then go person.city. And then you can see that that has been deleted. It's coming up as undefined. And undefined generally means if something is a value of this, which is just an empty string, and the data type is undefined. But if I was to do that, it should come back as London. So that's how you can delete items from an object. So simply delete person.city, and there you go. And those are the basics of object manipulation and understanding what an object is in JavaScript and how you can get it to work for you in your projects on the simplest of bases. JavaScript destructuring. Now, destructuring is a convenient way of extracting values from arrays or properties from objects into distinct variables. This is the type of thing that is really useful further down the line, especially as you move into more advanced JavaScript and front-end frameworks like React, Vue, Angular, etc. So let's have a look at the code and see how destructuring actually can work and how it can be useful. So let's start with array destructuring. So we all know what an array is. An array is something simple like this. So we'll create a variable called fruit and we'll make it equal to an array. And then within that array, we'll populate it with 3 values. So apple, banana, cherry. So first item, second item, third item. Now, the way we can destructure it is what we simply do is we create a variable, but the variable is actually the array itself. So we create an array here, and within there, we'll add variables that will go and grab the first value of the array, the second value of the array, and the third value of the array. So we can do first fruit, and that will go and grab the first item in the array. Then we'll go second fruit and third fruit. And then this is one of the most important parts, is we make it equal to the array. So what this is doing is, in a way, we're kind of doing this in reverse, but we're creating variables out of everything inside of it. So we're giving each one a variable name, and we're saying that by this let variable construct here, and then it's going to be equal to the array itself. So it's a slightly different way of declaring variables, but it works quite well, and I'll show you how in a moment. So if we go console.log first fruit apple, and there you go. So this variable here can be used independently, and I can show you how. So if I create a template literal and I go, this is a fruit, I go, this is a fruit, and then do a comma with space and say first fruit, and it will go, this is a first fruit apple, and you can start to use it in your JavaScript as its own variable. It's super handy. And this is just with arrays. There are ways to do this with other things as well. So just to prove to you that this all works, we'll do console logs for the others. And there you go. There's apple, banana, and cherry. All 3 are working. And that is how you can destructure an array to get the values you want. One other thing you can do is you can actually skip elements as well. So if, for example, you want to skip banana, you can do that easily. So you can do let equals fruits, and then we can say first, and we don't want banana, so we literally just add another comma and a space, and then we do third. Whoops. And then if we clear this and console.log first and third, we can see that works perfectly. So we were able to skip one of the array elements by just leaving a space, and we've just added the first and third. And this is something you can do with destructuring in JavaScript in general. And this is with all the ways I'm going to show you as well. So array destructuring is just one way of doing destructuring. Let's take a look at object destructuring. And as we go through these, you'll start to see patterns of how destructuring actually works in JavaScript. And there are some common themes throughout all the different ways of doing it. So let's go have a look at objects. Let's go have a look at object destructuring. So similar to how we looked at array destructuring, let's just create a very simple object. So we'll create a person object, and we'll have name, age, and city in here. And we'll just spread this out onto one line to make it simpler. There we go. So that's a lot easier to read now. And very similar to array destructuring, we'll do the exact same thing. So we'll create a variable, but the variable itself will be the object. So it will be a new object. So in an array, if we want to destructure an array, we use the square brackets. And if we want to destructure an object, we use curly brackets. And that is to signify a new object. And then within that, we'll do name, age, and city, because those are the 3 keys within the key value pairs of this object. And a best practice is generally when you create an object is you leave a space at the start and the end of an object. And then we'll do will equal to person, because that is what we want to destructure. And we can test if this works if we then console log all 3 of these out. And there you go. John, 30, New York, those are the properties of here. So just to clarify, these properties from the person object are extracted into variables name, age, and city. That's what this destructuring is doing. Now, another cool thing you can do with destructuring is actually rename these key names here. So for example, if you don't agree with the key name here, because let's say, for example, it's been created by the backend, what you could do is you could actually rename it. So if I delete this and then I decide I want to rename this, I'll go let create an object, and then I'll equal it to person, which is the object above, and we'll say name. I'll choose first name instead. So that's what this variable is going to be to reference this. Now, say for example, a backend developer may have created this key value pair structure And you might think that's not very friendly, that doesn't quite make sense, or you just want to change it so it matches your front end structure. So you may then want to destructure it and use a different name. And you can do that with destructuring. So that if we do age, we can call it years. And with city, we can just rename it to location. So not only can you create variables for it, but you can also rename the variable names to make it access the same keys, but make it make sense to you. And then if we console log first name, let's just change this one to place, because I think location is a safe word on CodePen. There we go. So if we change city to place, we can see that that works. And we can change this and it still should work. Brilliant. And then if we want to, for example, console log place, that works as well. We'll just double check. So there you go. You can assign properties to variables with different names. Now, another really powerful thing you can do is actually destructure with nested objects. Now, if you've never come across nested objects before, I'm going to show you exactly what that means and what the term nested means. So I'm going to create an object here that is nested. So nested essentially means that within it, there is a nest of further data. Oops. So let's take this for example. We have a object here called user, and within there we've got an ID of 1. That makes sense. That's on the highest level of this object. And then we have details, which is the next item, which is also on the highest level, but that is actually an object in itself. Let's just go down here. There we go. So details is an object, and because it's an object within an object, that's considered nesting. So nesting is like, if you've ever seen those Russian nesting dolls, where you can have a Russian nesting doll inside another one, inside another one, inside another one, that's essentially what nesting is in JavaScript. Especially in objects, that's what that means. So we have an object within an object, and we are actually going to destructure this. So I'll show you how we do that just now. So we're going to ignore everything else within there, and we're going to say details. That's what we're targeting, and open that up. And we're going to say this is equal to user. So we're still destructuring the user object like we normally would, but we've absolutely skipped ID and not even mentioned that or used it, and we're just simply targeting details right away. And then within that, we're going to say first name and last name. Now, if you, we just need to make sure we go and delete this here. We'll just comment this out. It's because it's clashing. Okay, because we've already declared those names up there. So you can see here we've destructured this. Let's just make sure this is out so it's easier to see. Okay, so that's a lot more easier to read. So we've got the details object here. We're destructuring it, first name, last name. Now, in the last example I showed you, we could normally rename it to something, but we're keeping the same name and we're going to create a variable of the same key value here. So we don't need to change anything. We don't need to add a double semicolon here and give it a new variable name because we're keeping it the same. And then if we log this out, you should be able to see that destructuring a nested object works just like this. And it's as simple as that. We didn't have to put ID. We just went straight to details and got the value that we wanted and destructured it. So this makes life a lot easier. So this tends to make life a lot easier. For example, you have a really, really big complex object with maybe 3 levels deep. So you could have an object within an object within an object with lots of information inside. And then within that, it's got multiple objects in other places as well. You can simply just target exactly what you want, destructure it, get the values, and use it in your JavaScript. This is a really, really good skill to have, and it makes your code a lot less messier. Now, one of the most useful forms of destructuring that I personally use in my day-to-day work is default values. So when you actually destructure a value, you can actually give it a default value as a fallback. And when I say a fallback means if something goes wrong and there's no data, no information, what is the default value that prevails and comes through first? So for example, in UI, you don't want it that if there's no information from the back end or there's no data coming through, you want there to be some base information that is already there and provided by the front end. So let's have a look at array default values, and that should give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So let's show you what default values in an array would look like. So we'll create an array here, and we'll say the first value is 10 and the second value is 20. And to destructure it, all we do is we go let and create an empty array like we've shown you in the past. And we'll say the first value is A and the second value is B. Okay. And what we'll do, and we'll say it's equal to array. Clear this. And if I console log A, it should give me 10. But what if, for example, I want to create a default value for it? So I'll say this is equal to 3, for example, and then I want to console log that out, it's still going to come back with 10. And that is because that value is still there. So if I was to delete this value and create it as an empty space, it then should return 3. And the reason why it returns 3 is because no value came through for the first array index. So imagine this is a bad data scenario. So you've had a call go up to the back end and no information has come through for the first array, but information has come through for the second one. Who knows what's happened? Something's gone wrong. But because we set a default value here, this was able to provide a fallback. So fallback here of 3. And essentially we had information there ready for it to be used on the UI, and we didn't just have an error showing or like an empty value, which would have been way more disastrous on the front end. And that's exactly what you want to avoid doing with JavaScript and front end. You want to make sure that the UI runs as smoothly as possible. And there we go. That is destructuring. Now, destructuring makes it easier to extract values from arrays and objects and allows for more concise and readable code. With all of this information here, you should be able to go in and use arrays and objects with way more confidence, and you're able to destructure the information that you get from arrays and objects to use it in your front end in a safe way that allows you to have fallbacks like here with default values and be able to control the information that you get a lot more precisely. And that is JavaScript destructuring. JavaScript template literals. These are the ultimate way to use strings in JavaScript. It allows you to do embedded expressions, multi-line strings, string interpolation, and allows you to really manipulate strings in a more intuitive and readable way. Now the best way to show you how powerful template literals are and how useful they are is by actually showing you stage by stage how you can make template literals work for you. So let's go ahead and have a look at some code. So when we think about strings in JavaScript, in the most simplest sense, we could think about something like this. If we use a let variable, for example, we'll call it name, and we'll say the string is Harry. That is the most simplest way to declare a string in JavaScript. We have just some text within these 2 quote marks, and that's it. And if we want to add some things together, so if, for example, we want to add a variable in there, and this is how I've shown you in the past, we could then do something like this. So we'll do let greeting equals hello, and then we'll leave a space, and then we have to put an end quote mark, and then we do a plus sign, and then we'll add the variable, which is up here, and then do another plus sign, and then add another exclamation point, so that it adds one at the end of the name, and we put how are you. So you see, this requires a different level of thinking and imagining how this would all work together, and it's a bit hard to see what the final version is going to be. So if I console log dot greeting, we'll kind of get an idea of how this is going to look. Greeting, yep. Hello Harry, how are you? So that works here, and if you're not thinking about these things, it can kind of get a little messed up. You end up with stuff like this if you make one mistake in how you think about this. But there is a better way of doing this. If I delete this, now above we have the traditional way of doing it, but if we use template literals, there is a better way of doing it. So if we take the exact same variable above, let greeting, and we do new greeting, and we simply add these backticks, which usually on a Mac can be found next to the Z key, but essentially it's these backticks. If you can find them on your keyboard, that's what this is, and that's how essentially you create a template literal. So with these backticks, we'll just close the line by semicolon, and we'll start typing in what we want. So if we look above, we do hello, and we do a little comma, and then to add the variable, instead of doing this plus sign, this quote, this space, all this stuff, we don't actually need to do that. We just add a $sign, do the open curly brackets, and then type in name. And then what we'll do is we'll put an exclamation point at the end, and it starts using a string again. So just to go over what this is doing here, this is essentially allowing us to use variables in JavaScript within a string. And for example, we're using name in here. Anything within here is JavaScript. Anything outside of here is a string. So then I can carry on and go, how are you? And then if I console log that out, let's clear this, and there we go. Hello, Harry, how are you? And I can change the name in here to, let's say, for example, John, and that works just fine. It's accessing this variable and it is doing exactly what we want it to do. But this is quite limited. This is only working on one line. And again, trying to do this on multi-lines can be quite complicated. So what's the solution? Well, again, template literals come in handy. If we have a look at multi-line strings with template literals, I'll show you what that would look like. So let's create a new let variable and we'll call it multi-line string. And we'll say this is a string that spans multiple lines. We'll do a full stop and we'll close the line off with a semicolon. And then if we console log that, and we'll just clear this, you can see that now we can console log things on multiple lines, and you can actually use this in JavaScript in case you need to use multiple lines in JavaScript. And this can be great for mimicking code or mimicking just some text. If you just want to write a block of text and not have to worry about writing one really giant line, it can all come across like this, and it retains the spacing. So for example, if I do a space here, it will remember that I had a space. So for example, if I change this to quote marks, we can see what happens. It simply doesn't work. And even if I return this to the same line, it then works. It retains the spacing memory, so it does remember that at least. But yeah, multiple lines just do not work on there. And then if you do this and you go back to template literals, you can then use multiple lines. Brilliant. Now let's take a look at embedded expressions. So embedded expressions in template literals is generally how you're probably going to use JavaScript in things like React or a Vue or some other kind of front-end framework or library in the future to build your website. So let's create a few variables here. So let's create let a equals 5 and let b equals 10. And then we'll create a sum variable here. And we'll say that is a template literal. So we'll do the sum of, and then dollar for adding a variable with open curly brackets. So now we've added a, and then we go and dollar b is dollar a plus b. So we're adding some sums here, and we're actually making calculations within our string, which is crazy to think about considering where we started on our understanding of strings in JavaScript. You know, it would be handy if we spelt it correctly. So that will go back to sum. Okay. Let's clear this and console log sum. So let's have a read. So the sum of a, and considering this is all a string, by the way, the sum of 5, yep, and 10, okay, is 15. And that makes complete sense. So if we were to do times, that works as well. So we're able to time a by b. This is the power of template literals. They are really, really useful, and going forward in other front-end frameworks and libraries and more advanced front-end, this is the type of thing you'll start to use time and time again, especially when you want to use different languages like French, German, or whatever to translate your base English text on your website. It's great for that. It's great for, you know, if you need to add a number to your text. So for example, if you have a checkout and you might want to say there are, and then we'll say something like checkout items. There are 10 checkout items. So for example, if you're building an e-commerce project, this is how things can be useful here when you want to add numbers from the back end into here. So fantastically useful, and that's what embedded expressions in template literals are. So just in conclusion, template literals make working with strings in JavaScript way, way, way more straightforward and powerful, allowing for cleaner code and easier string manipulation, and even for you to do expressions that are evaluated and are presented in strings itself. So there you go, template literals, very, very useful. JavaScript arrow functions, otherwise known as fat arrow functions. These are a great way of reducing boilerplate on how you declare functions, and it is a really good way for declaring smaller functions and anonymous functions. And I'm going to show you exactly how it works. So here we have your very typical function. We have a function declaration here, we have the function name, and then we have these curly little parentheses here with the parameters, and then we're returning the values up here within these curly brackets. And if we want to see the values, we do the typical declaration and then we initialize it and we'll add some numbers. Oh, just a little hint. So if you were to console log your function without any initialization, it actually just returns the entire function, which might be useful for troubleshooting, but generally you always want to remember that you need to initialize it. Now we need to add some parameters, so we'll add 7 and 12. and then that should add them together. Yep, it does, 19. Brilliant. So that function works, and that's great. And now what we'll do is we'll write an arrow function. And this is what an arrow function generally looks like. So we'll say const arrow, and we'll do an equal signs and then the parentheses and then arrow. And what we're saying is we're making this a function by making curly brackets as well. And we'll do the very same thing. We'll add some parameters and we'll return them. So A and B. And then below here, we'll do console log dot arrow and we'll do 3 and 9. And that returns 12, which is brilliant. So this is the core difference of an arrow function. So we're declaring it as a variable, as a const, and then we're adding the parameters, which is fine. Then we've got our arrow here. Now, generally, arrow functions are used for very small bits of code, for functional code that you can even just put onto one line. That's generally where arrow functions shine, for small bits of reusable code that you can use again. But there is another thing as well. You can actually create anonymous functions, which are really useful. And then you could do an anonymous function like this, for example, and that works. Now, the problem with this is in CodePen, anonymous functions don't necessarily work too well, but this will work in React or VS Code or something like that just fine. But yeah, that is anonymous functions. And yeah, they're pretty useful in JavaScript, especially for testing and things like that, and one-line bits of functionality. Now, you can see between the two, they're actually quite similar in a lot of ways. So they've got the name here, and this is saying this is a function, and this is saying this is a constant. Very similar so far. And it's even got these parentheses here. And the difference is it's got an equal arrow here, and you still have to return it, and it's got the open curly brackets. So really, where is the benefit? Well, arrow functions provide a more concise syntax for writing function expressions in JavaScript, and they're often used for shorter functions. Now, there are ways that you can write arrow functions in a more concise way, so it doesn't necessarily look like this. So for example, we don't need these brackets here, and I can prove that if I then console log this out, and then I delete the return function, and then it works just fine. So already you can see we've gotten rid of a lot of boilerplate. We've gotten rid of the return and these curly brackets. But beyond that, we can do even more. So if we don't have two parameters, we can literally delete all of this and console log an arrow function like this. And immediately you can start to see for smaller functions the absolute benefit of being able to use this. Later on down the line, you'll probably tend to write more arrow functions than you will regular functions, especially when you get into React and things like that. Arrow functions are generally what you tend to use. One of the benefits of using a function like this is you get to use the this keyword. It gives you access to scoped variables within the function. Arrow functions don't have that, and that's one of the major differences. But again, people don't really use this anymore, the this method and keyword, and that's why a lot of people have moved to arrow, because it's just, there's a lot more you can do with it. It's a lot sleeker, it's a lot quicker to write, and it's very precise syntax. So in conclusion, arrow functions are especially useful for very simple operations like we've mentioned, and can make your code more readable and concise. So in the future, if you try to write modern functional programming in JavaScript, it could be advised that arrow functions are probably a better way to go. Especially if you're in an interview or something like that, I would personally suggest to use an arrow function. And there you go. That is arrow functions, or fat arrow functions, in JavaScript. JavaScript default parameters. This is one of those things that helps make your front end and your UI way more bulletproof. It's the idea that if the data should fail, or in any way the information that you're trying to display in your UI doesn't work, that your UI and front end keeps on chugging. Now, specifically, default parameters allow you to initialize function parameters with default values if no arguments are provided, or if undefined is passed as an argument. So we're talking specifically about function parameters. So let's go take a look and see what it's all about. So to understand default parameters in a function, let's build a function to show you how they work. So we'll create a function called greet, which takes two parameters, name and greeting, and then we'll return it as a template literal, which means these backticks here, and it will create a string where we can put in JavaScript variables. So we'll put in the parameter of greeting, and then a comma and name. Now within a function, parameters act like variables that are function scoped for definite. And greeting here can be used within a template literal if you use these curly brackets and the $sign. And we've passed that in here. And let's console.log the greet function, and we'll just clear this. And you can see that we're returned with undefined, undefined. And that's because we've got two parameters here, but we haven't actually passed anything into the function initialization down here, which is in the console log. So let's change that and actually add some default parameters so that this can work. So one thing that I would do is with a name, if you haven't put in a name, then maybe we should call the person a stranger. And then for the greeting, we can just do a very basic one. So something like hello. So if they don't put anything into this, if they don't pass any parameters into the function initialization, then it should say hello stranger. And that could be the default message. But what happens if we pass something in? So for example, for greeting, we can say, let's say Harry, for example, and then it says hello Harry. And what if we want to change the second one? Oops, let's make that string, clear this. Hi Harry. So we have changed both of these messages, and we can then, if we wanted to, decide that we don't want to actually push the first parameter in there and just keep the second one. Well, to do that, to not include a parameter in a function call, you'd have to put undefined in, especially if it's a string value. So then it goes back to the default value, which is stranger, because it's the default parameter value. So it's hi stranger. And then if we delete that, and just leave one undefined, then it's back to the default message again. And then we can just change the first name, and we're back to using part default and part user input. And this is the power of using default parameters. When your data fails, or for some reason the information just isn't making it to your function, or there could be many, many reasons why the information is not making it to where it needs to get to, you ensure as a front-end developer, as a JavaScript developer, and as a programmer in general, that you ensure that your code has good fallbacks. So fallbacks being, if something fails, then you can fall back onto a default base level of operations so that everything chugs along smoothly and carries on working, and your UI carries on working, and your functions carry on working, etc. So that is the power of default parameters. It makes your code stronger, and it makes you a better developer, and you build stronger code that can last, that can weather the storm if anything goes wrong. Now this is a very simple example. I'm going to show you a bit more of a complex one so you get an idea of how good default parameters are. So I'll delete this now. So we're going to use one to calculate the total price with a tax rate. So if I create a function here, and we'll call it calculate total with a parameter of price and a parameter of tax rate. And within here, we'll return the price plus price times tax rate. So we want to calculate the tax rate affecting the price within this function. Oh, and we just need to make sure that we're adding that. And then I also want to console log calculate total. I'll clear this. Now you can see right now it's returning NaN, which stands for not a number. So it is definitely requiring price, but it's not going to be able to do much with price. So if I add 100, it's not going to do much, because really what it needs the tax rate by default. So we need to add tax rate as a default parameter. So 0.05 could be the default tax rate, and then that calculates correctly. So we always need to put a user input, so a total amount, so a total price that always needs to be there. That's the variable for this to work. But the tax rate, we could just add as a default. So we could say, well, the tax rate's always going to be the same. So we could always just add a default parameter. And the user does have the option of overriding it if it needs to change for different countries, for example. So for example, we could change it to a tax rate of 1.5. And then you can see that changes the tax rate considerably. Or if we change it to 0.5 and we change this amount to slightly different number, you can see how effective default parameters can become. Now you don't want to set something like this as a default parameter like the price, but a tax rate does make sense. So you need to start thinking in terms of what makes sense to add a default parameter and what doesn't. So you have to put yourself in the shoes of A, the user, and B, you have to think, well, what if no tax rate was given? What if the information failed? What if there's potentially bad data? You have to think very defensively when you're creating functions, and default parameters is a great tool to have to help you combat situations and future-proof your code in case something could go wrong, in case the user doesn't do this thing, or whatever the reason. That's how you make your code stronger. So default parameters simplify function calls and provide more robust code by allowing functions to handle cases where some arguments might be omitted. That is the power of default parameters within functions, and that is how you can write stronger code with it. And there you go. That is JavaScript default parameters. JavaScript promises. Now, this is one of those things that is very similar to closures. It can be a little complicated to get your head around, but I like to think of it in a very straightforward and simple manner. Promises are used to handle asynchronous operations in JavaScript. Now that sounds very complicated, but the simplistic version of that is they represent a value that may be available now or in the future or never. This is a promise that it will go away and try to get the value that you asked it to go for, and it may return or it may never. That is a promise. And what it does is it tries not to block the rest of your JavaScript code and the rest of your project from running on the single thread of JavaScript. So once that's all said and done, let's go have a look at promises where all of that will make way more sense. So like we mentioned, a promise is where you ask for information and it may or may not have it, but it doesn't block the rest of your JavaScript from working. Because as you may or may not know, JavaScript is a single threaded language. That means that at any one time, it can only be doing one thing. But with a promise, that circumvents that. It can go off and do what it needs to do and go and look and search for something and allow you to carry on churning your JavaScript code and go through, as we mentioned before, from top to bottom and run the process whilst it goes off and finds what it needs to find. And when or if it does, it can come back and let you know whether it was successful or whether it failed. So when we want to create a new promise, we declare it as a variable. So you can have it as a let if you want. And the way we do it is we do new and promise. Those are the key words to creating a promise, which is new and promise. And then we have some native parameters that come with a promise, which is resolve and reject. These are actually parts of the promise method. So if it resolves, you can say, okay, then execute this functionality or bring this back. And if it fails, then we do this. Now here we've got a declaration, and here we've got a declaration, and here we've got a declaration for simulating success or failure. So all we're saying is that if it's successful, then return true. So we're saying if true, and then resolve operation was successful. So this is mocking essentially the call to a backend or a database or something. And we're saying that it is successful for argument's sake. And then if it failed, then we reject it and we return this in the promise. Now, promises are not like other bits of data we've looked at in the past. Now, if I try to console log my promise, we'll see something very, very different. So if we console log promise, you'll see that we find that it just returns an object of promise. Now, a promise object is actually a stack trace of many, many things, and you can't actually get the information you want from a promise unless you pipe it out. And I'll show you what I mean by piping it out. So we have our promise here, and you can see this was what it previously returned. And then when you do a dot then, that's essentially asking you to do an action on there and piping it. So you've created a pipe here. So you're saying, then I want you to grab the message that comes back and I want you to console log the message from the promise. And that runs if it's resolved. And then you have a catch error here. So this is to do something when it returns successful. And this is to catch an error. So you do dot catch and then it console logs the error that is returned natively as a parameter here. So to test this out, we'll go all the way up here and we'll set the backend to false to say something went wrong. And that should trigger this line 18 here, which is the error. And then the error will be false and it will return operation failed. And that, in a very, very small microcosm, is how promises work. You go and ask for a promise to go and grab something, and then it tries to return that for you. Now, what we're going to do is going to have a look at an asynchronous operation within a promise in JavaScript. So the one that we looked at before, that wasn't asynchronous. This here, however, is asynchronous. And this means, like we spoke about earlier, it can go and run in the background and go grab the information without interrupting the single thread of JavaScript from running from top to bottom your code. Now, there's nothing asynchronous or different about this part of it other than the name here. The part where it's asynchronous is here, the set timeout. The set timeout simulates an asynchronous operation with a delay of 2 seconds, as if you've gone off to request something from an API or a backend somewhere else, and it's taken maybe 2 seconds, and then it's returned back to you. That's what this is simulating here, and therefore it is asynchronous. And the promise is resolved or rejected based on the simulated success or failure. Let's actually use this asynchronous promise with this message here. So we've got the async operation, which is the name of this, and then we're doing very similar to what we did before. We're then piping it to say, let's bring back the success message, and if it fails, bring back the error message. And after a 2-second delay, it returns with that. So let's increase this to 5 seconds. And after 5 seconds, we can see that it was successful. Brilliant. And then if we do this to false, and then we wait 5 seconds, so we're counting 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi, and then we can see that that has returned as a failed operation with a 5-second delay. Excellent. So promises provide a cleaner and more robust way to handle asynchronous operations compared to traditional callback functions, making code easier to read and maintain. And these are fantastic for when you have lots of different calls happening on your page at the same time, because generally you're not going to be calling just one API, you're not going to be calling just one backend, you're going to be calling multiple ones at the same time. So you want them all to go off and do their own thing and not block the other. And that's how promises later on in JavaScript become really, really handy. At the very start, you don't need to worry about promises just yet. It's more of a mid-level method that is useful later on when you're building websites, but it's always good to know at this stage. JavaScript modules. These are one of the most commonly used things that you're going to use as a front-end developer. Whether this is just creating reusable functions or whether it's creating components to use in front-end frameworks and libraries like React or Vue or Angular to use again and again and again. Modules allow you to break up your code into separate parts and manage imports and exports. So I'm going to show you how that works by creating our own module and using it again and taking parts from it and being able to break it up into smaller parts as we need to. So let's go take a look. So we're going to create a math module here. And to do that, we're going to just need to make a simple function. As in most things with JavaScript, it starts with just a function, and we'll build it up from there. So let's create a function called const math module, and we'll make it an arrow function. And within here, we'll create some named exports, things that'll be used by the module as core features. We'll create add as a core feature of this module, and we'll add 2 parameters, and we'll make this an arrow function as well, a plus b, and then we'll create subtract a and b as parameters, and then we'll say a minus b. And then we'll do pi as well, 159. And then we'll just have a default export here as the main thing that's called. And that's because it's the last one on the list. A and b, arrow function, a times b. Okay, and then we just need to tell the function what to return. So we'll return an object, and then we'll go add, subtract, pi, and multiply. So we're basically telling it what to return. Now, normally, if you were creating this in some JavaScript file, or if you were creating this in React or something like this, all you would simply do is basically say export here, and that would export the math module globally in your project wherever it's imported. And the way we import it, so for example, we've exported it here, we would do something like this: import math module from math module.js, wherever that's from. And if you wanted a particular function from that, you could go add, subtract, and use it as needed. But because we're using CodePen, the rules are slightly different, and we've only got one file to play with, I'm going to show you a way to simulate that. One way to simulate that in CodePen, as though this export actually worked, is to do this. So I'll delete that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this in an immediately invoked function expression. So that is an IFE, otherwise known as an immediately invoked function expression. That if we go down here, all we do is we add a initialization afterwards to initialize it. And this works as normal, but this is going to initialize afterwards. So it's just going to run itself. So now that it's running, we can actually start using it and using some of these values inside because it's returning it. So the way we do that is we go const add subtract pi and multiply, and we'll say that is access, and we'll say that is destructured from math module. So we'll clear that. So now that those are destructured from the import, and just to be clear, normally what this would be is something like this. So if you were doing this in a file, it would be import, and then you add these, and you would say where from. So you'd say from, if this was a library, for example, it could be something like that, from math module. Or if it's in a file somewhere, you could just direct link to that, wherever it is. But because we're simulating it, we'll do it like this. And then all we do, so we'll console log add 2 and 3, and there we go. That's returning a 5. So that is actually adding these two numbers together, which is reaching into the math module, grabbing this function here, and actually able to use it out here. At no point in conventional JavaScript should we be able to get the inner functions of a function scoped variable, because this is const add, we're not exporting it from here, but somehow using JavaScript modules, we are able to get access from it because we're importing it here, or mock importing it, mock meaning we're faking it just because it's CodePen, but you would have access to it like that. And then we can simulate that again. So subtract, which should return 3, and it does. We'll console log these out as well. And then if we try to console log pi, there we go. We've returned pi as well. And finally, if we use the multiply function, it should return 6. So there you go. That is the power on a very basic level of using JavaScript modules. And it shows you how you can import and export within a single file, and in this particular case, making it suitable for CodePen when separate files are not supported. So this example here demonstrates how to simulate module imports and exports within a single file. And it makes it suitable for environments like CodePen where separate files aren't really supported. But in reality, the way that you would do it is, like we've already mentioned, is export const simply, and that then becomes a module. And then you can then import it here like this. And this is a real world use case of how you would use it. And that should work, and that should give you access to all of this. So in a new file, you would import it at the top, and in its own JavaScript file somewhere, you would export it like this, but obviously without the IFE, the self-invoking function, or the immediately invoked function expression. So a very simple look at modules. But as we move into React and we start looking at some more advanced use cases of modules, we'll see how useful that this concept here can be later on down the road as a front-end developer. And that is JavaScript modules.